The rain came in steady, silver sheets, beating against the tin roof of the church hall like an old hymn played too loud. The wooden floor creaked under boots and the smell of baked apples, cinnamon, and damp wool filled the air. The harvest festival was supposed to be the happiest night of the season, neighbors gathering, children laughing, fiddle music echoing off the beams, but for Clara Mayfield, it felt like walking into a room where every eye saw too much. She stood near the far wall, her back straight but her stomach tight, clutching a thin shawl around her shoulders. The fabric was faded, more gray than blue now, but it was all she had that still felt decent enough for an evening like this. She'd sewn it herself last winter when the cold came and she couldn't afford coal. Her son, Tommy, stood beside her, his small hand buried in the folds of her skirt. He had his father's eyes, warm brown, full of questions she didn't always have answers for. "Ma," he whispered, tugging lightly. "Can we get some pie?" She smiled faintly, though her heart wasn't in it. "In a minute, love. Let's just wait till the line's shorter." The truth was, she didn't have the dime for it tonight. Maybe if someone left a slice behind, she could ask for it quietly. Pride had a way of breaking under hunger, but she still tried to hold hers together. Across the room, the door opened with a gust of cold rain and wind. A tall man stepped in, water dripping from the brim of his hat, his coat dark with the storm. He took a moment to shake it off, then looked around as if searching for something, or maybe someone. He moved with an easy confidence, unhurried, like a man used to his own company. No one knew him here, but people noticed him all the same. The older women whispered behind their hands, the men nodded curtly, sizing him up. The stranger ignored it all and moved toward the corner where the coffee was being poured, his gaze sweeping once across the room, then pausing when it met Clara's. For a second, she felt the weight of his eyes. Not judging, not curious, just steady. She looked away quickly, embarrassed. She wasn't used to being noticed anymore, not since her husband's death. In a town like Ridge Hollow, widows like her faded into the background unless gossip dragged them out again. Then the door slammed open a second time, and with it came trouble. Clyde Mayfield, her late husband's brother, stumbled in with two other men, half drunk and loud. His shirt was half buttoned, his boots muddy. He'd never forgiven Clara for refusing to marry him after the funeral, though it wasn't love he'd offered, it was control. And ever since, he'd found ways to remind her she was alone and without power. "Well, if it ain't my dear sister-in-law," he called, loud enough for the fiddler to pause mid-tune. "Ain't she dressed fine tonight?" A few heads turned. Clara's throat tightened, but she said nothing. Clyde came closer, the smell of whiskey thick around him. "You come here lookin' for another man to feed you, Clara. Maybe one of these good folk will take pity on you and your brat." Laughter rippled from his friends. Tommy's small fingers clutched tighter at her skirt. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her voice steady. "I came to let my boy see the festival, Clyde. That's all." He sneered, swaying on his feet. "That cabin you're livin' in still got my brother's name on it, you know. Law says it ought to come back to the family. Maybe I'll stop by tomorrow and make sure it's still in good hands." Something in her chest twisted. She wanted to yell, to tell him she'd earned every inch of that land with her work and grief. But her words caught in her throat. No one around her spoke. No one ever did. People turned their eyes away because it was easier. That's when the stranger set down his coffee cup and started walking toward her. His boots echoed on the wooden floor, slow and deliberate. The crowd seemed to part for him without a word. He stopped beside Clara, tall enough that Clyde had to tilt his head to look up at him. "Evenin'," the man said. His voice was calm, deep, the kind of tone that carried weight without needing to shout. Clyde frowned. "You got something to say, cowboy?" The stranger's gray eyes flicked once to Clara, then back to Clyde. "Yeah," he said. "This lady's with me." The words hit the room like a spark in dry hay. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Clyde blinked. "With you. That's right." The stranger shifted his hat slightly, revealing a hint of the scar along his jawline. "My wife doesn't owe you, or anyone, anything." "Wife?" Clara's breath caught. She looked up at him in shock, but he didn't glance her way. He just stood there, steady as a wall, his hand resting casually near his belt buckle. The crowd began whispering, the tension easing into curiosity. Clyde gave a rough laugh, but it sounded weaker now. "Your wife, huh? Didn't know Clara'd gone and married herself a stranger." Now you do, the man said. So unless you came to apologize, I reckon you should walk away. The silence between them was thick as molasses. Clyde's jaw worked, his pride pricked, but something in the man's stance, the quiet threat of it, made him back down. He spat on the floor and muttered, "You'll regret crossin' me, mister." Then he turned and staggered off, his friends following behind, muttering under their breath. The music started again, uncertainly at first, then stronger. The crowd relaxed. A few women exchanged knowing smiles, others looked at Clara with surprise and maybe a touch of pity. Clara, still frozen in place, finally turned to the stranger. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. He removed his hat and ran a hand through damp hair. "Seemed like you could use a hand." I didn't ask you to lie." "No, ma'am," he said gently. "You didn't. But I figured a small lie's worth the peace it bought you." She didn't know what to say. Gratitude tangled with confusion, and a strange flutter she hadn't felt in years. "I don't even know your name." "Luke," he said simply. "Luke Danner." "Clara," she replied softly, though he already knew. He'd heard Clyde say it, but somehow it felt different now, the way it left her lips. A pause stretched between them. The fiddler started another tune, slow and sweet. Luke glanced at the dance floor, then back at her. "You dance, Mrs. Danner." Her cheeks colored. "You don't have to keep up the act." He smiled slightly. "Maybe I just want to dance." Tommy tugged at her hand. "Go on, Ma," he whispered. "You look pretty." And so she went. Luke led her to the floor, his hand light at her waist, his steps sure and patient. She hadn't danced since before the war, before her husband's death, before life had turned into one long stretch of surviving. But now, under the glow of lanterns and the hum of strings, she felt her heart remember something: how to move, how to breathe, how to feel alive again. They didn't speak as they danced, but something passed between them, unspoken and quiet. When the music slowed to its end, he bowed his head slightly. "Thank you," he murmured. "For what?" she asked. "For letting me pretend," he said. "Sometimes it feels good to belong, even just for a while." She looked up at him, and for a fleeting second, she saw not a stranger, but someone who understood loneliness the way she did. Someone who carried his own kind of grief. Outside, the rain eased into silence. Inside, Clara Mayfield, poor widow, quiet mother, forgotten woman, felt something stir that had long been buried. Not love, not yet, but maybe the first small, trembling step toward it. Morning sunlight spilled across the hills, warm and gold after the long night of rain. The earth still smelled of water and clay, sweet and alive. At the edge of the valley, Clara Mayfield's small cabin stood like a stubborn survivor, its porch sagging, its windows patched with care, its chimney curling thin trails of smoke into the sky. Clara stepped out barefoot, her skirts damp from the dew as she hung a basket of wet laundry on the line. Her hands were raw from scrubbing, but she didn't mind. The rhythm of work steadied her thoughts. She could still hear the echo of last night, the music, the laughter, the stranger's calm voice claiming her as his wife before the whole town. It had been a lie, yes, but one that had saved her from humiliation, and worse. She had hardly slept after coming home, her mind replaying the way he'd stood there, unflinching, while every other man in the room looked away. He hadn't left right away, either. When the storm grew heavier, he'd walked her home through the rain, carrying Tommy on his shoulders while the boy chattered happily. He hadn't minded the mud or the cold. When they'd reached the cabin, he'd tipped his hat and said he'd stay on the porch till the weather cleared. Now, as she pegged the last shirt on the line, she saw him still there, Luke Danner, sitting with one boot resting on the porch rail, sipping from a tin cup. He looked half asleep, half lost in thought, his hat tipped low against the morning light. "You didn't have to stay," she said softly, folding her arms as she walked up to the steps. He looked up, eyes steady and gray as smoke. "Didn't figure it was right to leave a lady and her boy alone in a storm." "You could have stayed at the inn," she pointed out. He smiled faintly. "Could've. But I like the sound of rain better than people talkin'." She wanted to smile back but didn't. It was dangerous, this feeling of comfort around him. "I appreciate what you did," she said after a moment. "Truly. But now that Clyde thinks I've gone and married again, there'll be talk." Luke shrugged, setting his cup down. "Let him talk. Better gossip than trouble, I'd say." She hesitated. "Still, I can't keep up a lie like that." He gave her a gentle nod. "Didn't ask you to." One night was enough. Tommy burst out of the doorway just then, his hair a tangle of gold curls, clutching a small wooden horse Luke had carved from a scrap of firewood. "Ma, look, mister. Luke made this for me." Luke chuckled. "Ain't perfect, but he'll ride as far as your imagination takes him." The boy grinned, racing into the yard to play. Clara watched him for a moment, then turned back. "You're good with him," she said quietly. He shifted, a shadow flickering across his face. "Had a little brother once. Didn't see him grow up much, though." She caught the sadness in his tone but didn't press. Everyone in these parts carried ghosts. Hers were buried not far behind the cabin, beneath a wooden cross that leaned a little more each year. They fell into easy silence after that. Luke chopped wood by the fence, strong and sure with every swing, while Clara swept the porch and fetched water. The sound of his axe against the log was rhythmic, steady, oddly reassuring. She found herself glancing at him now and then, the way the sunlight caught the curve of his shoulders, the way he paused to wipe sweat from his brow. There was something about him that didn't fit the life of a drifter. His clothes were plain, but his manner wasn't. He carried himself like a man who'd known both labor and leadership. When he stopped to take a drink, she asked, "You said you were headin' west. You got family out there?" He leaned against the post, thinking. "Had family here once," he said finally. "Now it's just me and a few acres that keep me too busy to remember the quiet." "So you're a rancher," she guessed. He gave a small smile. "Something like that." It wasn't much of an answer, but she didn't push. She could tell he wasn't used to talking about himself. Later, while Tommy chased chickens in the yard, Luke helped her mend the barn door. He worked fast, his big hands surprisingly gentle with the old wood. Clara passed him nails and watched, half in awe, half in gratitude. For the first time in a long while, her little home felt alive again, someone else's laughter, someone else's presence filling the air. When the job was done, they sat on the porch steps eating cornbread and leftover stew. The air was warm now, the scent of wildflowers drifting down from the hills. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked quietly. "Every winter," she admitted with a small laugh. "Then spring comes, and I think maybe I can make it one more year." He nodded. "You've got grit. Not many folks do." "It's not grit," she said softly. "It's just, there's nowhere else to go." He looked at her then, really looked, past the tired lines of her face, past the frayed shawl and worn shoes, to the strength beneath it all. "Maybe there's somewhere you ain't seen yet," he murmured. She met his gaze for a heartbeat too long, then looked away, heart fluttering. As the sun began to sink behind the hills, he saddled his horse. She watched quietly, hands folded, not trusting herself to speak. Tommy ran up and threw his arms around Luke's leg. "You gotta come back, mister." "Luke," the boy said. "You promised to teach me how to ride proper." Luke ruffled his hair. "Then I reckon I'll have to keep that promise someday." Clara stepped forward. "You're leavin' already?" He nodded, tightening the saddle strap. "Can't stay too long. Folks might start expectin' things." She swallowed. "Expectin' what?" He looked at her over his shoulder, eyes soft. "That maybe I ain't just pretendin' anymore." Her breath caught, but before she could say anything, he pulled himself into the saddle. "You take care, Clara," he said. "If you ever need help, you ask for Luke Danner out at Silver Creek Ranch." Her brow furrowed. "Silver Creek. He said, tipping his hat. "Guess I should have told you the truth sooner. Not much of a drifter, I'm afraid." She stood still, the name echoing in her mind. Silver Creek Ranch was one of the biggest spreads in the county, a name that carried weight. He'd been sitting on her porch all morning like a hired hand, never saying a word about who he was. Before she could find her voice, he turned his horse toward the road. "Tell the boy I'll see him again someday," he called. The sun flared behind him, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose. She watched until the sound of hoofbeats faded into silence, until all that was left was the soft rustle of wind through the grass. That night, when she tucked Tommy into bed, he asked, "Ma, do you think he'll come back?" She brushed his hair gently. "Maybe, sweetheart. Maybe one day." After he fell asleep, she stepped out onto the porch. The stars were bright, scattered across the wide sky. On the railing lay a single silver button, polished and gleaming in the moonlight, left behind from his coat. She picked it up, turning it over in her hand. Weeks later, a man from the bank rode up to tell her the cabin's debt had been cleared, the land papers signed over in her name. He didn't say who had done it, but she didn't need to ask. Clara pressed the silver button to her heart and smiled softly. "Thank you, Luke," she whispered. The wind carried her words across the valley, past the fields and fences, toward the far-off lights of Silver Creek Ranch, where, somewhere, perhaps, a lonely rancher looked up at the same stars and thought of the widow who had once called him husband for just one night.